Hello and welcome to DSP Leaders World Forum. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content at TelecomTV, and coming up now is our Solutions and Strategies Roundtable, where we'll be discussing Open RAN and asking what's the plan for 2021. Now, interest in Open RAN is at an all-time high. It may even be eclipsing 5G on the Marketing Hype Index, which would be quite an achievement. Yet this belies its importance and potentially game-changing capabilities, as we discovered in our Open RAN Summit just a few months ago. But will the initial enthusiasm and support continue to grow and make Open RAN the leading architecture choice, or will the established status quo prevail, relegating Open RAN to just a supporting role in our future networks? Well, let's find out what our special guests think, and I'm delighted to introduce Yago Tenorio, who is Head of Group Network Architecture at Vodafone, McRae, MD Architecture and Technology Strategy and Chief Architect, BT Group, Olivier Simon, who is Director of Radio Innovation at Orange, and Azhar Sayeed, Global Chief Architect at Red Hat. Welcome everyone, very good to see you all again, and thanks for joining our State of the Industry debate on Open RAN. Now, my colleague Ray Lemaitre and I have compiled some talking points based on the feedback from the TelecomTV community, and it's the areas that they want to hear about and that also reflect to some extent their concerns here. So up towards our first point, rural deployment is all well and good, but telcos really want to see how viable Open RAN is in dense urban areas. Yet the technology and architectures are still years away from being truly carrier grade. Yago, if you don't mind, I'm going to come to you with this first one. Is the meat of this, is the real proving ground the urban deployment of Open RAN? And just how far away are we from maybe achieving this?
Well, I'll say yes, telcos want to know for sure. I want to know. Now we have a view on that. I think rural is probably carrier grade today. If you are looking for a 2G, 4G technology that you can deploy in rural where there is no such a stringent requirement on capacity or performance or multiple frequencies, you can do it today. And then the question is when will it be at the same level for dense urban? That will require 5G, first FDD, 5G, and then massive MIMO. That will also require a 4G, say, premium with multiple frequencies, with carrier aggregation and with sufficient capacity and the right performance. So all in all, I don't think it's years away, but it could be 1 year away, maybe 18 months away.
Thank you, Yago. Well, what do our other guests think? Olivier, maybe I can come to you first on this one. Is there a sense that there is still some time to go before we get to this so-called carrier grade stage? And also, what's the importance of rural deployments against urban deployments?
Yeah, the first thing to say is that the rural deployment is ready, and there are as well other type of deployment that could be done, such as indoor systems or private network. Then when we are talking about the urban deployment, what makes the difference between rural and urban? The first difference is the number of frequencies. We need to deploy many frequencies in main city because of the capacity that is needed. And the other difference is 5G and massive MIMO. And I very much agree with what Yago said. We see the industry developing in preparing this massive MIMO stuff, and we are confident. I mean, we are starting to test such solution. They are good quality, but they need to get more mature. And I think we will have both the software and the hardware ready for urban deployment in this time frame, 2022, maybe 2023.
Thanks, Olivier. And Azhar?
Yeah, hi, Guy. I think I agree with the previous point that was made, which is if you classify urban and rural in the context of deployment of massive MIMO and higher density, then the answer is yes, we probably need a little bit more time before some of those solutions become mainstream from different radio vendors. But if you classify requirements of urban as the need for deploying small cell, the need for deploying millimeter wave, the need for deploying, some mid-band frequencies, then the answer is, well, there are solutions that are available today that can be deployed using Open RAN capabilities with open front haul and mid haul, and the split RAN functionality that allow you today to actually realize those. So I think often people get confused and say, well, the only way I can get to market is massive MIMO. Yes, massive MIMO is important. And I think for massive MIMO to become mainstream with the set of frequency requirements that carriers have, I do believe, yes, I agree with that totally. It'll take a little bit of time. But otherwise, I think there are many areas in which carriers can start to do work today, get the experience, get the deployment models going.
Thanks, Azhar. And Neil, so where do you sit on the Open RAN readiness scale?
I mean, listen, I think there's an amazing amount of work going on Open RAN, and we see, some big deployments out there. But I think, I'm going to use the golden word. It depends. And it depends on what you need to do and what you need to achieve. If I think about our situation where we operate here in the UK, there isn't really an Open RAN solution that I can deploy today, because I need 2G, I still need 3G for a period of time. I need 4G, I need 4G MIMO, and I need 5G, and I need 5G massive MIMO. And you can't buy that today. And I've got a checkbook ready to write checks for those that can show me that solution. Now, I think there's a vast number of vendors working on all of these things. And I think that some of the work we've done here in the UK to pull those vendors together is starting to show some great outcomes, but it's still some way off. Being able to deploy the type of spectrum we've got, the type of capabilities we've got, and also recognizing that, the networks don't stand still. We'll start deploying SA soon. That brings other new challenges. We've got spectrum auctions coming up in the UK over the next 12 months. That brings another set of requirements. Handsets and how handsets work also brings some requirements. So I think, is the kit technically available in some cases for some of these use cases? For certain. Is it deployable in every operator's own ecosystem? I think there's still work to do before it's really, truly universally available. We're partnering with Nokia, who in my mind is the largest Open RAN vendor in the world. Also one of the proprietary vendors, but someone who has some fantastic experience in this space. And they're working flat out, but I also need some capabilities that are unique to the UK. We have some requirements around health and safety that take time for each of these vendors to bring to the market. So I think rural. Why are we picking rural? It's not to pick on the people who live in rural. It's because typically the requirements we've got in rural locations are simpler and more straightforward. Perhaps one frequency, perhaps just 4G, or maybe two frequencies of spectrum, just makes it that much easier. So deploying it there, as many of us are doing 4G to 5G refreshes, makes huge sense. It's not, I would argue that we're not singling out rural deployments. I think actually in the ecosystem of network development, the time is right for us to refresh rural locations, and it just so happens that Open RAN's ready for that.
Great indeed, yes. Now, it appears that we spent a lot of 2020 focused on Open RAN software, but hardware deployments and hardware developments, particularly in terms of like silicon components, are just as important, but maybe they're more or less visible than the software work. So do we know what work is going on here with boxes and silicon, or where we are, where the state of the art is in terms of the hardware that supports Open RAN?
Yeah, I can take a start. There's a lot of work that's being done by general purpose hardware companies, right? So whether it is the OEMs of the world that are built on Intel platforms, or some of the NVIDIA ecosystem with ARM capabilities. What we've seen over the last 12 months and specifically is new hardware that's coming out at the market, whether they are the FPGAs or the GPUs, and some of the new roadmap for EA6 and some new hardware acceleration cards. Now, these allow processing of signals and data in a much faster way at those far edge locations where RAN frames are being handled. So that's really important, because if you want to deal with multiple sectors, multiple cell sectors, if you want to do forward error correction, and if you want to do proper packet processing at those locations so that you can actually really conform to the split RAN architecture, then you need this type of hardware acceleration and capabilities. And we've seen some good improvements in the last 12 months or so. As a platform vendor, we do talk to all of these people, and we try to understand what their roadmap is in order to enable those capabilities in the software platform. And that's what we've seen. Now, it's true that some of these are yet to be mainstreamed because we are a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of where the conversation is. And you will see actually in the next few months, some of these being announced, some of these being available for people to consume. But from the RAN vendor standpoint and from a platform standpoint, we've been aware of some of these roadmap items, and we really think that'll make a difference in terms of the overall capacity ROI as we look at deploying these open platforms for RAN.
Good to hear. And Olivier, would you like to come in on this question?
Yeah, sure. Because it's a kind of paradox. It's not very visible, but it's probably the place where you have the highest investment level in Open RAN. The big companies building silicon code are very conscious that it could become a huge market. And what we can see is that on top of Intel, who have been very public since years now in creating FPGAs and now a more advanced solution to accelerate especially the layer 1 processing, we can see a new trend looking at GPUs, for instance, that could also be very efficient in terms of layer 1 acceleration, and even more dedicated chips that could be integrated into the servers, into the data centers, and that will really change the power efficiency of such Open RAN solution. And currently, let's say, previously with only 4G, it was an optimization, because still it was possible to use only x86 kind of processor to perform the layer 1. But with 5G, massive MIMO, and the fact that we are operating with much wider frequencies, it's not anymore a choice. It's not anymore an optimization. In order to do 5G massive MIMO, you must have a good acceleration technology. So it could be based on FPGA, which is kind of mature today, but GPUs are coming, and even more advanced silicon are in the process of being built. And it will radically change. It will radically accelerate the Open RAN roadmap. And again, it's not very visible, but it's probably the place where you need to look at if you want to understand how quick could the Open RAN could be deployed.
Great, thank you, Olivier, for those insights, and we will certainly be looking closely at this area on Telecom TV in the year to come. Now, another area that is concerning our viewers, based on their feedback to us about this topic, is that Initial significant Open RAN efforts will likely be dominated by the largest operators, the tier ones, that will then be able to shape the market to meet their specific needs, leaving others little choice but to follow suit. Yago, is that maybe a slightly unfair reaction to what's happening in the work that's being done?
Well, I certainly see it the other way around. So if you look, for example, at the Open RAN project group in TIP, we chair that group. There are no less than 30 active players there, and not all of them are tier 1 operators. Most of them are not tier 1 operators. They are active members. They are contributing when we are building the specification together. So it's not only tier 1s, certainly. And furthermore, everything we do in there is publicly accessible by anyone. So anyone can access the specification. It's public, and we are making all efforts to make everything we do available to everyone. So I think I understand I don't think it's a criticism, but I understand the observation, but I don't think this time around that is the way things are happening. I think, I agree on the previous question. I think my colleagues share their perspective on hardware, on radio and baseband, which I very much agree. And I think there is a lot of progress beneath the surface. Now, if you look at, for instance, what's going on with the DU, both the first generation and the second generation for the DU, there is a specification that is shared and is being used by many operators to specify what they want to buy. We have on the radar 5 different suppliers that are providing according to that specification, and that's not just to us. And I don't think we are the ones shaping that. I think it's a joint effort, and it's got to be that way. I think Open RAN is too big for any single player to make it successful. I think we need all the industry to be coordinated.
Oh, Neil, please.
Yeah, I quite like to come in on that. I think, listen, let's think of the customer for a minute, something that we as telcos are not that great at and something we need to do better at. No one comes into one of our award-winning EE stores and says, Neil, I want to be on EE because you're using Open RAN. No one says that. So, we are all fighting a brand war, a device war, and ultimately an experience war. How can we provide the best experience to our customers? And Open RAN is but one of many tools in the toolbox to help us with that. But I reflect on what was just said, which is all of these vendors are building the same thing. They look the same way, and they're not going to give me any differentiation. And that worries me a little bit, because the differentiation becomes this: money. And in our industry, we've had a kind of a race to the bottom mentality. And I wonder if in Open RAN, if we have that same mentality, how many of these vendors will survive? How many of them will actually be able to make a return so that they can invest in the next set of silicon that we've just talked about? And in particular, in massive MIMO and beamforming, we're going to need a level of parallel processing that's probably relatively unique in industry. Perhaps some of it's in optical networking, but it's something very specialized. And I think one of the great things recently, in my mind, and I've been kind of shouting about this, which is software will not cure all of the issues. We do need hardware, and we need these vendors that are coming in and trying to expand the ecosystem and expand the choice to be able to generate a return. Because if they can't, they'll disappear, or they'll be acquired, or they'll move into other more profitable businesses. And that'll be exactly where we found ourselves now, and why we've created Open RAN. And I think the whole ecosystem of telecommunications, and we as operators, needs to change. For too long, we're focused on the plumbing when we need to focus more on what can we offer customers. Open RAN gives us some opportunities in that, perhaps with private networks and enterprises, allowing us to share networks better and neutral host. But we've got to really, really, really keep the customer front of mind on this, because it's easy to get lost in the engine room. And frankly, our customers really don't care what kit we use at the end of the day. They want the only time they care is when it doesn't work. And pretty much all of these suppliers are very reliable, have the same level of uptime. It's then what's unique to your area. So I do think there is a concern, back to get back to the point, I do think there's a concern where some of the large operators have got unique requirements in their marketplace that could drive those vendors to, sign a big deal with big telco in Germany or big telco in the UK or big telco in America that's perhaps unique to that region, where they're focused on the development for that region. However, it's in the name, open, so anyone can build it because all the specs are open, all the solutions are open, the architecture is open. But I think it is about reacting to those individual features that aren't really part of the specs or the architecture, but are required by some operators.
Azhar, please.
Yeah, sorry. I think there are 2 points here. One, the one that Yago raised earlier, that answers your original question, is who's driving the conversation around Open RAN? Is it the big guys or is it the small players? And you got an answer there that's saying, no, it's equal. In my experience, what I've seen is the smaller players are far more nimble because they don't have the kind of baggage the bigger players do carry of older generation technologies and making RAN ready for all of the older generation technologies, which Neil actually alluded to in his first comment on the first question. So in my experience and my conversations, I've seen actually the smaller players be more nimble about it and be more, adopting this kind of technology and capabilities faster than some of the larger players are, to Neil's point. But the second point was what Neil raised, which is the concern that he expressed around innovation in terms of hardware evolution. I think, disagree with Neil on that point, which is, if there is a concern, I think there is a value migration here that's happening. Previously, people were all focused on building appliances that bundled hardware and software together and provided value through that particular proprietary integration and proprietary technologies. This whole open conversation is all about disaggregating hardware and software so that you can actually take a best of breed approach. And then in that process, when you commoditize the hardware elements, the value comes through the software integration and software sitting on top of the table. And so the value migration is happening there from that particular hardware appliance type of device and hardware capabilities to how you can leverage those capabilities within the software and how software can drive that particular infrastructure. You're seeing that in the context of how hardware has evolved through DPUs. I didn't get a chance to talk about that particular topic, where you now have specific processing and a general purpose processor on the NIC card so that actually a server looks like a distributed processing unit. So that's one. Another area is this whole RIC architecture that ORAN has defined, for example, where you run XApps. XApps are nothing but third-party applications that glean based on the RAN database, RAN information that you have gathered to provide more capability, self-organization, and third-party services. So we'll see that. We'll see a lot of value migration towards these kind of capabilities going forward.
Well, hold that thought on RICs, because we're going to come back to that a little bit later on. Yago, you wanted to come in earlier to address, I think, maybe something that Neil had said, or pick up on his comment.
Yeah, no, I think both of you made really good points. I think continuing with that study, I think we need to remember why we're doing this in the first place. So Open RAN came as a way to diversify the supply chain, a supply chain that has consolidated itself to a point that is leaving very few choices and very few options. So I think it's a way to increase the optionality and to bring a wider ecosystem. And the main effect, if we do that well, I think the main effect that will have is increased competition in innovation, not just in cost. So it's not just that we're increasing the commercial temperature and we're going to get better, whatever, prices. I think the more important thing that we're trying to achieve with Open RAN is an increase of the innovation pace. And I think massive MIMO is one good example, as it's probably the harder problem that we need to crack at this point. You see that today, and that will make a big difference to your customers, Neil, and to mine as well. It will make a big difference to be served by 5G FDD or DSS compared to a high frequency massive MIMO with plenty of spectrum, right? Gives you much better performance, it gives you much more capacity. However, it's super expensive as of today. Now, the first thing that Open RAN made is immediately to make a few suppliers they became available in this space. So when you look at who's doing massive MIMO today that you can be rolling out in dense urban next year, Neil. So apart from probably Nokia, but I think I would disagree that they are the biggest Open RAN player yet. But I think they have good plans, but a bit late. But if you look at what Samsung is doing or what Fujitsu they're doing, I think they will have very powerful massive MIMO products next year, probably this time next year. And that will be more competition and competition in innovation as well. Now, the other players are following. In general, they are players who can afford doing their own ASICs. So you will see the likes of Mavenir or NEC or others joining a little later maybe. But then there is one thing that is happening that is new, and I think Olivier touched on that before, which is the big, really big giants on silicon. They are actually putting together system on a chip to do the massive MIMO heavyweight calculations, and then wrapping it up through partnership with others to deliver the whole massive MIMO system that you can use in your Open RAN. That would have never happened without Open RAN. That is a quantum leap. And when that finally hits the market, I think it will make a difference to the customer. So I think, to me, that is a good example. And I think that is a good sign also that things are going on the right direction. And I think RIG is another fantastic example of something that may not be commercial yet, but is there on the spec, on the architecture. And the first experiences that we're having on the lab, they're really promising. I think we may touch on that later.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Yago. Well, we started this discussion looking at where we were going in 2021 with Open RAN and what we're likely to see. Another point that Ray and I received from our viewers is that industry bodies and specification groups are still too dominated and influenced by the traditional vendors that might be holding up Open RAN progress. We've already mentioned a couple of the big players already in who's leading the way with Open RAN. So let's split this into two parts first. Firstly, are the industry bodies and specification groups still too dominated by the large traditional vendors? And secondly, are we being held up, or are we going at a rapid pace already? Olivier, have you got any thoughts about this process?
Yeah, it's a good question, but the way it is said is a little bit too simple. So the first thing to say is that if you're looking at 3GPP, for instance, in 3GPP you have groups. Some of them have more than 1,000 delegates. And if you're looking at how many delegates there are from operators, it's true that we are probably like maybe 100 times less than the vendors. So from this perspective, if you're looking at 3GPP, it's true that the ratio of operators versus vendors has changed a lot in 3G, 4G, and now 5G. And this means that in terms of technical specification in 3GPP, big, large vendors have a significant power in influencing these specs. But this is also one of the reasons why the ORAN Alliance has been created. I don't want to be provocative, but in 3GPP, if you're looking at the number of interfaces that are defined, you have probably less than 10% of them that are really multi-vendor. So you're defining an interface, but at the end, more or less from the beginning of the specification that this interface will remain internal to one given vendor solution. So with the O-RAN Alliance, the idea was to say, okay, this is not very satisfying because we are defining interfaces, but at the end we have a closed box. We recognize that 3GPP is very important and we contribute in 3GPP, but we need something more. We need to select some of the interface and to secure that this interface at the end could be multi-vendor. And this is what we have done in the O-RAN Alliance. And this has some implication in the way the O-RAN Alliance is working. One of them is that the operators are putting significant resources. I mean, I'm talking about technical people being able to write a specification. You also have some non-traditional vendors, some challengers that are there. And it's clear that their interest is that these specifications are progressing quickly enough. But where it's not black and white, you also have incumbent vendors such as Nokia and Ericsson, who are really big contributor in the specification of the O-RAN Alliance. So it's not, I mean, as clear as what you're saying. People do contribute where they think it's their interest to contribute. But we have both small vendors, large vendors, and operators that are contributing to this move to openness. And the mix of this contribution is different to what we have known with 4G in 3GPP. But I could not say that it's like fully controlled by incumbent vendor who would like to stop the activity and so on. I mean, it's not possible. We have created the condition to have a fair level of contribution and a fair level of power from these different type of actors. And this was an important condition to make the Open RAN concept flying.
Thank you, Olivier. Any other guests got thoughts about the makeup of who's contributing?
I would just agree. I think there's been a myth around the standards, how they work, and it's like the heavy arms of the vendors control over. I've never subscribed to that at all, and I think that is a myth. I don't think anyone's holding up any development of standards or anything else, and I think probably, if anything, we've probably got too many standards or too many standards groups trying to overlap each other. But in O-RAN, I think the mission's pretty clear, and I think the momentum is super fast in many areas. But I think to be honest, and I challenged our government here. They were focused on this point. I said this isn't an issue that needs solving. It's working very well, and I think there's a huge amount of collaboration.
Good to hear. Thank you for that, Neil. Azhar?
Short point here. I think O-RAN really changed that. O-RAN and the operators' interest really changed that, where previously there was certainly a domination of some of the larger vendors who controlled, the conversation in many ways. I think with the emergence of O-RAN Alliance and the drive that some of the operators put into that, and effort they put into it in terms of driving newer specifications, disaggregation of these different components, really changed that dynamic to the point that now I agree with Olivier that it's a fair game and it's an open game for everybody, and that has actually forced some of the incumbents or some of the bigger vendors to come back to the table and contribute, because otherwise, the train's leaving the station. Yeah.
But who were driving the vendors? Us operators. They build stuff that we want. So I think it's a bit, I wouldn't like to say that it's really, a heavy arm, and they've had to swing to work with Open RAN because we as the buyers have said, hey Nokia, hey Ericsson, we need you to work on ORAN because it's important to us. But ultimately it was down to us, and also the kind of mechanics of the mobile industry, GSMA and 3GPP, which, if I compare it to the rest of telco standards, is different. So, I'm not sure I fully agree with that. I think we drove the outcome that we had. We've changed that as operators and as buyers, and the vendors have maybe, a couple of them slower than they should have been. One that definitely needs to move faster. But I think they were doing what we asked them to do, frankly.
Okay, well, I think we have time for one more statement that was basically derived from our feedback with our viewers. As I said, we wanted to look at where 2021 would take us with Open RAN. So here's what we're also hearing. Deployments in 2021 will not really educate the market as to its full potential, as deployments will only be small, focused, and they won't include key elements such as a mature RIC, which brings us on to a supplementary point, and that is, what is this importance of the RIC? Yago, perhaps I could start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I think the question has two parts, right? So the first one is about the size and the nature of the deployments that we can see maybe this year. And I don't agree that they will not serve us right or they will not educate the market. You have to start small, and small volumes in 2021 will lead to a volume rollout in 2022. So you have to walk before you run. We decided to start in rural for all the right reasons, and I think Neil explained very well before. So that will be it's not a laboratory, is the first experience that you're going to have with the technology, and then you can refine the specification, then you can make sure that you debug the software, integration issues, whatever, they will get sorted before we start rolling out volumes. But is that not the way that we've actually rolled out every single technology? And I don't mean starting with rural. This is just, by coincidence, I think Open RAN is particularly well suited today to start in rural. But if you think of 5G, is it not true that the early versions of 5G had some, flaws on it? Is it not true that the second version coming, or the third, or the next release will have some improvements? Well, I think it's the same with Open RAN. So I think the deployments that we may actually see this year will actually be, very useful to have a fully functional, Open RAN in the future, and it will improve year on year. That's the way technology cycles operate with Open RAN or with traditional RAN. The RIC point is true. I don't think it'll be ready for prime time this year. Maybe next year we'll see it. And I think it's got a particularly high value, as Azhar was saying before. I think it's been specified in the context of Open RAN, and is a really great platform to deploy innovation in a very quick manner, and widening the ecosystem to tap onto companies that have fantastic ideas that you could not deploy before. We have in our labs, we are trialing an over-the-top channel estimation for massive MIMO that is also doing massive MIMO scheduling in an app that connects to the main system through a RIC interface. It's too early to say because we don't have the results yet, but all indicates that if expectations are met, this app could reduce the cost of the DU by 30%, or in other words, it will make the hardware 30% more efficient, which is completely unthinkable before. Now, will it be ready for commercial deployment this year? No, but I tell you what, if I can sign up to this working and being commercial next year, I think that's good enough for me.
Well, we're all looking forward to seeing developments there, absolutely. And as Yago mentioned, you talked about the RIC earlier. Why is it so important?
Well, RIC provides a platform to now leverage different ISVs, different partners, to actually add value to the overall system. Previously, you had to rely on the big vendor because they were the only ones who controlled the whole RAN infrastructure. And then whatever they would provide in terms of optimizations and whatever requirements that you fed back to them were the only way you could solve that particular problem. Now, RIC completely disaggregates that. It now looks at the objects that are in the database, the capabilities that are RAN capabilities that are in there collected, and now you can run analytics on it. Then now you can run, like Yago was just describing, channel estimation. I was actually talking to a couple of ISVs, very small players, who have built some interesting XApps that can utilize the RIC interface to provide spectral efficiency, to provide better, performance overall. And I think as you start to disaggregate and use those, standard chipsets, now you can actually add value, put more innovation through these type of XApp model, and run it in a cloud native manner, more importantly. So now you can actually continue to build a common platform and start to add value continuously through different kinds of pieces of software, which was absolutely true what Yago said, which is never possible before, now certainly possible.
Thanks, Azhar. And Olivier, do you think the deployments we'll see in 2021 will indeed be useful and provide useful benchmarks? And are we still waiting maybe a year or so for a mature RIC?
No, the deployment in 21 will be useful, for sure. I agree that it will not represent like 20 or 30% of the base station that we have, and it's just a normal thing. I mean, when we are investing as operator, we are usually investing for 5 to 8 years, depending on the solution. So there is an investment life cycle that will be respected. It will not change with Open RAN. We will not swap all our network overnight with Open RAN. So what is important in 21 is not necessarily to look at the number at the end of the year, how much of the base station have been swapped to Open RAN or have been introduced in new area. This is not the important thing. The important thing is that 2021 will be the year where we will start this deployment. We will learn about we know the challenges, but we will learn how to overcome all these challenges, like integration, like managing the SLA, the end-to-end solution, and so on. So it's a very important year, 2021. And in the question, the scale of the deployment is not the good KPI to look at. The good KPI to look at is at the end of 2021, how good will be the Open RAN deployment. And then just a word about the RIC, because the RIC is a very important piece in the Open RAN architecture. Currently, we have we call that SON system, for self-organizing network. We have the possibility to plug some intelligent system on top of the radio access network, but there are two main issues with that. The first issue is that the interface between this system and the radio access network is not very stable. It's difficult to manage when you have two different vendors because this interface is not well defined. It's not an open interface with public specification. So this is the first issue. And the second issue is that this interface is very slow. So what you can do with a SON system is basically the same kind of thing that you would do with many engineers, but you can do that, let's say, in a more automatic way. With the RIC, we can overcome these two problems. The problem of the interface, we will have, this interface is called the E2 interface for the near real-time RIC. And this interface will be defined properly. It will be public definition, and it will be easy in an Open RAN system to master that this interface will be stable and will stay compatible with any change that you can make on the RIC system. And The second big gain with this interface is that it's a very quick interface. It's an interface that where you could manage the radio access network below a timescale of 1 second. So this means that some algorithm that would be totally impossible to do previously, like for instance machine learning for when you have mobility in the cell, this kind of thing that require a very quick interworking between the RIC and the RAN will start to be possible. And I'm sure that this piece of the architecture will generate a lot of innovation. We will see a lot of different startups in this area. And this will really help the operator to have better network and to have also the capability to differentiate more.
Thank you, Olivier. And Neil, final thoughts from yourself about your expectations for Open RAN in 2021?
Yeah, I mean, listen, Open RAN's here to stay. There's no doubt about it. It's got fantastic momentum. As I said at the start, there's some really amazing stuff. It feels like the momentum of wireless has caught up with the momentum of cloud and internet, which is great to see. I think there'll be some challenges. I think the point made earlier about learning, is the Open RAN that we're all deploying over the next 2 years same as the Open RAN in 3, 4, or 5 years? I suspect we'll learn things and change them as we have done already. And the outcomes will be interesting to see how the traditional vendors, Nokia, Ericsson, and Huawei, where they can be deployed. It'll be interesting to see how they react to it, because they're not going to stand still. And as we, if I think about when Huawei entered the market, they brought pricing down massively for everybody, and this will have the same outcome. So I think we'll get more competition, which is definitely good because it drives efficiency, and then leading to that, Rick, I come from a systems background. I'm kind of, in some ways, really excited about it, because in the rest of the network, we've kind of had that for some time. So real-time telemetry, automation through MI, network optimization, better network planning, all of those capabilities, we've had that really well defined in the rest of the network, particularly in the kind of network core for fixed and transport. So, but you initially see a lot of momentum, and then as your needs change, it can then potentially, I'm worried, it maybe becomes a little bit of a bottleneck. For us, we're looking at it potentially as a way of dealing with some of the legacy challenges we've got that allows us to unlock, unlock being able to roll out Open RAN in the areas where we want to, without having to worry about the legacy where Open RAN doesn't have capability today. That's one way we're working on it. We're working with Canonical, who's an outstanding partner for cloud and operating systems, and together with both Nokia, Juniper, and Parallel Wireless, we're talking to all of those guys around what their RIC can do and what they see the opportunity. But for sure, real-time telemetry, understanding the performance of what's really happening in real time and reacting to it in millimeters, in microsecond speed. We run the emergency services network in the UK, and that's life or death. You can't wait for things to fix. You've got to be able to react very quickly.
Thank you very much, Neil. And with that, we have to draw our discussion to a close. Thank you all for participating and sharing your views and opinions on Open RAN. If you're watching this on day one of our DSP Leaders World Forum, then don't forget to send us any questions you have on this subject, and we'll try and answer them in our live after-show program later today. Otherwise, please take a look at all the sessions from this year's World Forum. We're making them available for on-demand viewing throughout the week. Today is focused on the Open Telco, but we're covering 4 other important topics as part of this year's event: enhancing the ecosystem, cultural transformation, 5G and sustainability, and DSP revenue streams. We have a great lineup of speakers this year across our roundtables, interviews and live Q&A programs. So please keep watching and do get in touch with us and let us know your views. For now though, thank you and goodbye.